At 7:16 on a Monday morning, a state contract auditor called Halden York's general counsel to say a classified propulsion program had fallen below its certified personnel floor. I was $315,000 short of the pension contribution I needed locked in before my rate lock window closed in 6 years, and I heard about the call 40 minutes later, standing in my own kitchen in Huntsville, coffee going cold in my hand. I checked the inspection seal in my coat pocket out of old habit, the same hand-stamped steel die I'd been the sole authorized holder of for 11 years, its edges worn smooth from 2 decades of use before that. My name is Samuel Ingram. I'm 55, and for 9 years I was the Quality Assurance Program lead at Halden York Defense Systems, the one whose stamp certified every finished unit the government accepted on that line. 41 days earlier, Milena Efimova had told me, in front of 2 directors, that the company rewards outcomes, not tenure. The corporate language for the denial was compensation aligned to demonstrated impact. The plain language reality was that after 9 years of a clean audit record, I'd asked for a raise and been told, calmly, that I should be grateful for the opportunity in the first place. I hadn't called the auditor's office. I hadn't leaked a staffing number, hadn't warned a single colleague to leave, hadn't done anything except stop renewing a personal request I'd made, unpaid and unasked, to an executive search firm for over a year. Please don't approach anyone on my own team. That request had never been a contract term. It was a favor, the kind experienced people extend without ever being asked to, and 39 days after I quietly stopped extending it, 6 certified engineers who'd been underpaid as long as I had were gone. I want to be precise about the order of things, because the version that reached the board afterward wasn't quite the version that happened. I never told anyone at that search firm who to call. I simply stopped telling them who not to. I'd held the retainer with that firm for a little over a year by then. A legitimate, fully disclosed advisory arrangement, the kind plenty of cleared senior engineers keep on the side, reviewing technical qualifications for openings that had nothing to do with Halden York. Every few weeks, the recruiter running my file would ask, out of professional courtesy, whether there was anyone at my own company she should keep off her call list. For over a year, I'd always said the same thing. My whole team, please, leave them alone. It cost me nothing to say it. It had never once been a condition of the retainer. The rest happened without me. The government's own compliance calendar required Halden York to report certified staffing levels on that program on a fixed periodic schedule, one that had existed since before I was hired onto it. Nobody at Halden York had checked those numbers against the actual roster in months, because nobody had ever needed to before. By the time I finished my coffee, I already understood something Milena apparently hadn't. A contractual staffing floor doesn't care whose outcomes anyone rewarded last quarter. It only cares whether the roster matches the number, and for 11 days, it hadn't. Nobody in that general counsel's office, I'd learned by lunchtime, had realized the clock behind that phone call had started the exact morning they decided 9 years of my work wasn't worth a raise. To understand why that auditor's call mattered, you have to understand what the seal in my pocket actually authorized. For 24 years in defense manufacturing, the last 9 of them at Halden York, I didn't need a finished goods report to tell me a unit had a tolerance problem. I could hear it in the pitch of the pressure test rig before the readout ever printed. A half-second delay in the seal cycle meant a fitting was mistorqued 3 stations back, long before anyone downstream filed a non-conformance report about it. 4 weeks before the raise conversation, I was on the floor at the Huntsville plant for a pressure test validation on the propulsion line, the air thick with cutting oil and the low mechanical hum of the test rig cycling through its sequence. I pulled the calibration log at Station 6, scanned 2 shifts of test data in under 2 minutes, and caught a drift pattern nobody else had flagged. A sensor 0.3% out of spec, quietly certifying units that were technically compliant, but drifting toward a threshold that would matter in another month. I flagged the sensor for recalibration that afternoon, verified the fix myself before the next shift, and stamped nothing until I'd watched it run clean twice. Nobody at the government's acceptance office ever knew there'd been a drift at all, because drift I caught early never got the chance to become a finding. Rafael Quintero, who'd run quality with me since before either of us had gray in our hair, found me at the calibration station afterward. "You're still the only one who checks the rig before you trust the readout, Sam," he said, not looking up from his own clipboard. I didn't answer. I just capped my pen and went back to the floor. None of that mastery came free. I'd missed more of my son's Little League seasons than I could count chasing test validations, and I was still 6 years from closing the gap in my pension contributions that 2 lean recessionary years had left behind. I never once mentioned that to anyone at Halden York. It wasn't the company's business, and a man who explains his sacrifices out loud usually stops being trusted to make them quietly. What I actually held wasn't glamorous. Calibration protocols. A hand-stamped seal that meant something specific to a government inspector who trusted my signature for 11 years. Executives only knew the acceptance rate stayed clean every quarter. They never asked who kept it that way, the same way people trust a bridge without asking who signed off on the load calculations. That was 9 years of the arrangement at Halden York, 24 in the trade. I showed up, I stamped what I'd actually verified, and nobody upstairs ever had to think about what happened if the person holding that seal stopped being the only one who could. The certified staffing requirement on the propulsion program wasn't exotic either. Government contracts on classified work write it plainly enough. A minimum number of credentialed personnel actively assigned at all times, verified periodically, no discretion built in for a company that happens to be short that quarter. I hadn't written that clause. I'd simply been one of the small handful of engineers who actually carried the credential it required. I'd never once thought about that requirement as anything resembling leverage. It sat in a contract binder in a compliance office 3 floors from mine, doing nothing, asking nothing of anyone, right up until enough of the people who satisfied it stopped being there to satisfy it. Milena Efimova had been Halden York's VP of Program Management for 4 years when she first told me tenure wasn't a metric she tracked. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the raise conversation, in her office with the Program Excellence plaque mounted at eye level behind her desk, positioned so anyone sitting across looked at it whether they meant to or not. I'd come in to ask about the compensation review cycle. "I want to be transparent, Sam," she said. "We're moving to a lean staffing model. Compensation gets aligned to demonstrated impact, not years of service. My impact is 9 years of clean acceptance rates on a classified program. What would demonstrate more than that? Tenure by itself doesn't move outcome metrics, throughput, defect rate, cycle time. Tenure is why the defect rate is what it is." She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the conversation is a formality. "I hear you. But I can't justify a raise based on sentiment when the data says the program's running fine without one. The program's running fine because I'm the one certifying it. Everyone on that floor thinks their role is the load-bearing one, Sam. That's normal. It's also not how we make compensation decisions anymore. What does move the needle then? Efficiency. Adaptability. We rewarded a junior engineer 8% last quarter for cutting test cycle time 12%. That's the kind of outcome I can take to the board. Cycle time doesn't matter if the units fail acceptance. Mine haven't. Not once in 9 years. I'm not disputing your record. I'm telling you the record isn't the argument it used to be. Then what is? Bring me a number," she said. "Something I can put in a slide. 9 years, 0 defects isn't a number leadership responds to anymore. It's a vibe. I'll let that sit for a second. A vibe. You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean," I said. "I just don't think you know what the credential I hold actually requires of this company, separate from anything you put in a slide." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. I'd suggest reading the staffing clause on the propulsion contract sometime." "I have. Recently, actually. I sit on the review board for that contract, Sam. I don't need it explained to me." "Then you already know it doesn't leave discretion for a lean quarter. Not on the credentialed personnel floor." She didn't ask why. She closed the folder in front of her instead, the meeting apparently over as far as she was concerned. "We reward outcomes, Sam. Not tenure. I'll see you at the review." I've spent 24 years believing honest work eventually speaks for itself, without anyone needing to argue on its behalf. I still don't know if that was ever true, or if it just took longer to be tested than I expected. I don't know how many people are with me at this point in the story. If you're one of them, sticking around is the only reason a channel this new gets to keep telling stories like it. One new one, every day. I didn't argue further. Arguing with someone who's decided a 9-year record is a vibe never changes what the record says. I walked back to the floor thinking about a clause Milena hadn't read closely enough to understand. The same clause that was about to make a 9-year record calling itself outdated the least available thing in that building. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I sat across from Milena in the same office, the same plaque behind her, with the formal compensation review on the calendar for exactly this purpose. I'd like to request a raise to bring my compensation in line with the market rate for a program lead with my credentials, I said. 9 years here, 24 in the field, 0 acceptance failures on a classified line. I appreciate you bringing data instead of just tenure, she said. Unfortunately, the review board landed on a different allocation this cycle. What allocation? We're prioritizing retention risk on newer hires this year. Frankly, Sam, people at your stage of career tend to stay regardless. It's not really a flight risk we need to manage. So the raise goes to people you're worried about losing, not people who've already proven they won't leave. That's a simplification, but not an inaccurate one. I sat with that for a moment. I've been offered outside consulting work before. I've turned it down every time. And I appreciate that loyalty. Genuinely. She folded her hands on the desk. But loyalty isn't a line item I can put in front of the board. Outcomes are. I turned down a director-level offer from a competitor 2 years ago. That never showed up on a slide either. I'm not disputing that you've had options. I'm telling you options don't move a budget allocation. Results do. What outcome would justify it? Honestly, at this point, probably nothing short of the program failing without you. Which, respectfully, it isn't. That was the whole conversation, in essence. They were saving roughly $5,165,000 a year across the tenured engineering staff by holding raises to the newer hires instead, and I was expected to be grateful for having a job that, by her own account, would keep running fine without any recognition at all. I understand, I said. Thank you for the clarity. That's it. No pushback. Would pushback change the board's allocation? No. Then there's nothing to push back against. You've told me exactly where I stand. I appreciate knowing. She looked, briefly, like she'd expected a different reaction, a raised voice, a resignation threat, something to defend against. I'm glad you're taking it well. I'm taking it accurately, I said. That's different. Is there anything else? She asked, already reaching for the next folder on her desk. Just one thing. If the program's genuinely fine without recognizing anyone's tenure, I assume that means the credentialed staffing requirement doesn't actually depend on any specific person either. She paused, pen still in hand. Why would you ask that? No reason, I said. Just confirming I understood the position correctly. I didn't argue further. I didn't threaten to quit, didn't ask for a counteroffer, didn't say anything that would let anyone in that building describe me later as difficult. I stood, thanked her again, and walked back to the floor, past the program excellence plaque one more time, thinking about a phone call I'd get in 2 days from a recruiter who'd been asking, politely, for over a year, whether there was anyone at Halden York she should keep off her list. That was their first real mistake, and it wasn't the number, and it wasn't the plaque, and it wasn't even the meeting. It was never once pulling the staffing appendix off the shelf to check what it actually said, before deciding out loud that a 9-year record was a vibe. The recruiter called my cell Thursday afternoon, 2 days after the review, at the same time she called every few weeks, like clockwork. Hey Sam, quick check-in. I've got 3 openings this month that fit your background almost exactly. And the usual question, anyone at Halden York I should steer clear of? I stood at my workbench, the pressure test rig cycling behind me, and said nothing for a second longer than I normally would have. No, I said. Nobody in particular this time. No one. You've said your whole team for over a year. My team's fine. Reach out to whoever you'd normally reach out to. There was a pause on her end, the kind that comes from someone recalibrating a note in a file. Got it. I'll take you off that request going forward. Appreciate it. That was the entire exchange. I didn't give her names. I didn't tell her who was underpaid, who'd been passed over, who might listen. I answered a routine courtesy question the way anyone answers a question they're no longer inclined to answer generously, and hung up the phone to go check a calibration log I still hadn't finished. That evening, at my kitchen table, I pulled out my own copy of the propulsion program's staffing appendix, a document I'd been given as a matter of course when I was first credentialed onto the contract. Nothing classified about the staffing clause itself, nothing I hadn't read a dozen times over 11 years. The rule was simple. The program required a fixed minimum number of specifically credentialed personnel actively assigned at all times, verified against the roster on a recurring compliance cycle, with no built-in tolerance for a temporary shortfall. I'd never seen it tested. Nobody had ever needed to test it, because nobody credentialed had ever left in a cluster before. I checked the seal in my coat pocket, out of habit more than need, and kept reading. If the roster dropped below the floor and stayed there through the next scheduled compliance check, the report would flag it automatically, routed straight to the state contracting authority. No executive discretion, no internal override. From tonight, whatever happened next had 39 days to run its course before that check came due. I went over the math twice, the way I'd double-check a torque spec before signing off on it. Not because I doubted the appendix, but because I wanted no one, later, to be able to say I'd misjudged how much time this actually gave anyone to fix it quietly. 39 days was long enough for a company that took the roster seriously to backfill 2 or 3 credentialed positions through ordinary hiring. If anyone had bothered to notice the gap forming and treated it as urgent. It was not a trap with no way out. It was simply a deadline nobody at Halden York knew was running. I hadn't scheduled that check. I hadn't leaked a number to anyone, hadn't told a single colleague what I'd stopped saying on the phone that afternoon. I'd simply let a courtesy I extended for free, for over a year, expire the same way any unpaid favor eventually does, quietly, without a formal notice, without anyone owing anyone an explanation. I closed the appendix and set it back in the drawer. Whatever happened in 39 days wasn't going to be my doing. It was just going to be what the roster actually said, once nobody was quietly patting it on my own time anymore. Nico Alvarez told me most of this secondhand. Over the following weeks, in the flat way he reported everything he'd rather not have noticed. The first resignation came 10 days after my call with the recruiter, a senior propulsion engineer named Deacon, credentialed on the same contract I was, who'd been passed over for a raise the same cycle I had. Milena told the floor it was a natural attrition event, nothing structural, and moved his workload onto 2 junior engineers who weren't credentialed to sign off on anything. She used the word natural twice in that meeting, Nico told me. Like it was weather. Did anyone ask who was covering the staffing floor? I asked. She said HR was actively backfilling. They hadn't posted the requisition yet. 2 more resignations followed within the week, both credentialed, both engineers who'd sat through the same compensation cycle Milena had called fair. 2 more today, Raphael told me over coffee. Both cited the same reason on the exit form. Better recognition elsewhere. Did HR flag the pattern? HR flagged the paperwork. Nobody's connected it to the staffing floor yet. They will. You sound very certain for someone who claims he's not involved. I'm not involved, I said. I'm just good at reading a calendar. By then, Raphael had started tracking the roster himself, unofficially, in a spreadsheet he didn't share with anyone above him. We're 4 below the floor, Raphael told me, quietly, in the break room. Nobody upstairs is counting. Are you going to tell them? I'm not the compliance officer of record. That's technically still you, on paper, even though you're not running point on the program day to day. I'm aware, I said. Doesn't that bother you? Sitting on it. It's not mine to sit on, Raphael. I have no authority over that program anymore. If I go tell Milena how to read her own contract, that's me doing her job for her, for free, the same way I used to do the recruiter a favor for free. That's a very specific way to phrase not caring. I care plenty. I'm just done being the one who acts on it. Milena, meanwhile, presented a leadership update calling the departures a healthy generational transition, pointing to 2 new junior hires as proof the pipeline was working. Neither new hire held the credential the program required. One of the senior engineers still on staff asked, in front of the room, whether backfill hiring accounted for clearance timelines that typically ran 90 days or longer. We're accelerating the process, Milena said. I'm confident we'll close the gap well within any relevant window. She didn't specify which window. Nobody pressed her on it. An analyst 2 seats down leaned toward Nico and murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. I give it a week before somebody asks what relevant window actually means. Nico didn't laugh. He just wrote the comment down in his own notes and kept his face flat. I heard all of it after the fact. The way you hear weather reports for a storm that's already moved through somewhere else, 3 floors from where I actually work now. I wasn't in those meetings anymore. I wasn't asked, and I didn't volunteer. 39 days is not a long time when you're counting toward a deadline you know is running. It is considerably longer when your VP has told the entire leadership floor, twice, that the gap was already closing. The compliance report went out automatically at 6:52 that Monday morning, 39 days after I stopped renewing a favor nobody had ever required me to renew. Exactly on the cycle it had always quietly run on. I was at my own workbench when Raphael called, voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. The state auditor's office called General Counsel directly. We're 4 credentialed engineers below the floor on the propulsion contract. Has been for a few days, apparently. Nobody caught it until the automated report went out. That's what the report is for, I said. Do you understand what this puts at risk? That contract's worth something like $2.17 billion over the 18 months left on it. Divide that out and you're looking at close to $4 million a day if the program gets suspended pending recertification. I didn't set the floor, Raphael. I just finally stopped covering for the fact that nobody else was watching it. By 8:15, the floor 2 above mine had the particular electric hum of a building pretending to work while doing nothing but refreshing the same compliance thread. My own phone buzzed twice, numbers I didn't recognize. I let both go to voicemail and finished torquing the fixture, the pressure test rig cycling steady behind me, indifferent to whatever was happening 3 floors up. Nico texted at 9:40. Auditor's office wants a corrective action plan by end of day. Legal's asking who's the credentialed signatory of record on file. I read it, set the phone face down, and went back to the calibration log. Raphael called again at 10:30. They found your name. You're still listed as the program's compliance point of contact. Nobody ever formally reassigned that when they moved you to a different line. I'm aware. Did you know that when you stopped calling the recruiter? I knew the appendix listed me as the point of contact when I read it that night. I didn't do anything with that fact. I just didn't correct it for them. That's a very fine distinction, Sam. It's the only distinction that matters. I didn't withhold information anyone asked me for. I answered exactly what I was asked, both times. Once by the recruiter, once by Milena in her office. Nobody asked me the right follow-up question either time. People are going to say you should have volunteered it. People say a lot of things about outcomes they didn't want to happen. 9 years, I volunteered things nobody asked for constantly. I got told that wasn't a metric anyone tracked. Raphael was quiet for a second. That's going to land differently in a boardroom than it does over coffee. I know. I've had 39 days to think about how I'd say it. By 11, Milena herself called, the first time she'd dialed my extension directly in 9 years. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Sam, I need you to walk me through the credentialing requirement. Right now. Which part of it? I explained the whole thing to you 3 weeks ago, in your office, next to the plaque. She didn't answer that. In the silence, I could hear, faintly, someone else in her office asking a question I couldn't make out. I need you up here, she said finally. Now. I finished the fixture and capped my pen. Milena's call made 3 that morning from people who'd never dialed my extension before. That was when I understood the calls weren't going to stop until somebody in that building had an answer she didn't already have. Milena's office was full when I got there. General Counsel, a board member named Whitfield I'd only seen at an annual town hall, and Raphael, who'd invited himself and hadn't been told no. The program excellence plaque was still behind her desk. Nobody was looking at it. Mr. Ingram, Whitfield said, you're still the credentialed compliance point of contact on the propulsion program's staffing appendix. Were you aware the roster had fallen below the floor? On paper, yes, I'm still listed. I read the appendix the night after my compensation review. I didn't audit the current headcount, though. That responsibility hasn't been mine day to day since Ms. Efimova reorganized reporting lines. Nico slid a folder across the table before anyone else spoke. My annual outside activities disclosure, filed with HR compliance 14 months earlier, the recruiting firm advisory retainer listed on it in plain language. This has been on file the whole time, he said. Compliance signed off on it as non-conflicting when he submitted it. Whitfield read it, then passed it to Milena. She looked at it for a long moment. The first time, I realized she'd ever actually seen it. You've had an outside recruiting contract this entire time and never told me, she said. I disclosed it exactly the way policy requires. To HR, in writing, 14 months ago. It was never yours to be told separately. Milena spoke next, sharper than I'd heard her before. This is still a technicality. Sam raised a theoretical concern in a meeting weeks ago. He never once said, explicitly, we are below the floor. I asked you whether the staffing requirement depended on any specific person, I said. You told me it didn't. That's not the same as a warning. It's not a warning. It's a fact I confirmed with you directly, in this office, and you confirmed it back. None of that is a violation on Mr. Ingram's part, counsel said, reading flat from a printed page. The staffing appendix's notice obligation runs to whoever holds program authority. That's Ms. Efimova. Exposure is contractual, not criminal. Suspension risk and a corrective action penalty if the floor isn't restored inside the window, roughly $4 million a day. That's the number the auditor's office already has. Malena's face didn't move. Her pen, turning between two fingers since I sat down, went still. Malena tried once more. I'd like it noted that Mr. Ingram had every opportunity to raise this formally. I raised it formally, I said. In your office. You told me tenure wasn't a metric you tracked. I have no further channel available to someone who's already told me, twice, my input doesn't count. So what do we do? Whitfield said, right now today. You need 4 credentialed engineers back on that roster before the corrective action window closes, I said. I know 3 people who'd come back for the right terms. I'm not one of them, unless the terms include mine, which are formal reassignment of compliance point of contact, in writing, full market rate adjustment, retroactive, and Raphael gets sign-off authority on any future staffing decision touching that program. So this doesn't happen to someone else. Malena finally spoke. This is extortion. It's a list, Raphael said. Extortion would be making the departures worse. He's telling you how to fix it. Whitfield looked at Malena, then back at me. We'll accept the terms. Draft it. I set the inspection seal on the table, not surrendering it. Just setting it down where everyone in that room could see the thing they'd spent 3 weeks calling a vibe. The written agreement landed in my inbox 2 days later. Formal reassignment of the compliance point of contact designation to Raphael. Full market rate adjustment retroactive to my request date. And sign-off authority for Raphael on any future staffing decision touching a credentialed program. No settlement to sign away the story. No number attached to my silence, because I hadn't asked for one. 3 of the departed engineers came back within the month, on terms Raphael negotiated directly, not me. Deacon was one of them. He told me later he'd have stayed all along for half of what it took to bring him back. He just hadn't had anyone in that room who thought his tenure was worth the argument. Malena kept her title. She lost the thing that made it mean anything. Raphael's name went onto the staffing appendix's signature line where hers used to be, and the program excellence plaque came down off her wall within the month. Nobody told me why, and I never asked. I heard she spent most of the quarter explaining a clause she'd once called a technicality to a board that no longer took her word for it. My last morning walking the propulsion line as its old point of contact, I stopped at the calibration station out of pure habit, the pressure test rig cycling its same steady rhythm. The readout was clean. It would have been, with or without me there to check it. That was always the actual point of a floor written into a contract instead of into someone's memory. Between the retroactive raise, the retention adjustment, and the accrued back pension contributions, the total came to $8,050,000 over the life of the agreement, closing my 6-year pension gap in under a single payment cycle, with room left over. I hadn't asked for that specific number. I'd asked for the raise to be fair and the pension math to finally work, and it turned out those, added up honestly, came to more than I'd expected. I never called that recruiter back to ask her to reach out to anyone. I never told a single colleague to leave. I answered one honest question on the phone, the way I'd answered 1,000 honest questions over 24 years, and let a clause someone else had written, years before I ever needed it, do exactly what it had always been sitting there to do. People ask sometimes whether I regret how close it came to actually costing the company the contract. I don't particularly. I think about that plaque more than I think about her, mounted at eye level for every visitor, for years, as a reminder of the exact kind of outcome she'd said was the only thing that counted. She got one. It just wasn't the one that used to hang on the wall. I think, too, about how small the actual mechanism turned out to be. I never withheld a lie. I never invented a fact. I simply stopped saying one voluntary, unpaid sentence to a stranger on the phone and let a document older than my employment do the rest. For 24 years, I'd assumed loyalty like that was worth something automatically. It was never automatic. It was a choice I kept making, for free, until someone told me plainly it wasn't worth paying for. I still carry the seal, in the same coat pocket, worn smoother every year. There's no program left that requires it of me specifically anymore, but old habits, unlike vibes, don't need anyone's permission to keep going.